Benjamin Netanyahu says Iran will pay for its missile attack, while Tehran threatens a crushing response if Israel hits back. Bombs, bullets and missiles in Gaza, Lebanon and Israel. Is the Middle East inching closer to full-blown war? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, Iran has carried out a major missile attack on Israel. In retaliation, it says, to the killing of the leaders of Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as a senior commander of the Revolutionary Guard. Israel says it intercepted most of the around 200 missiles with the help of the United States. World leaders are urging both sides to step back from the brink of a regional war. But Israel has promised to respond, warning Iran will pay for what it describes as a big mistake. So what would that response look like? And after nearly a year of war on Gaza and a campaign of air raids in Lebanon, is Israel able to fight on a third front? We'll discuss that and more with our guests. But first, this report from Ferdia Carr.
These were the skies above Israel's largest city, Tel Aviv, on Tuesday night. Iran fired nearly 200 missiles. Israel says most were intercepted, but several appeared to get through. One landing near the headquarters of the Mossad intelligence agency. Tehran says the attack was in response to the assassinations of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh, as well as the killing of several senior Iranian military officers. In a statement, President Masoud Pezeshkian said, "This action was in defense of Iranian interests and citizens. Prime Minister Netanyahu should know that Iran is not warmongering and will stand firmly against any threat. This is just a glimpse of our capabilities. Do not engage in conflict with Iran." In Tehran, people came out to the streets to celebrate. Leaders there have promised an even larger strike if Israel responds. And Israel has pledged to do just that.
Iran made a big mistake tonight and it will pay for it. The Iranian regime doesn't understand our determination to defend ourselves or our resolve to strike back at our enemies.
Some missiles were intercepted with the help of Jordan and the United States, which has been anticipating the assault.
The attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. And this is testament to Israeli military capability and U.S. military. It's also a testament to intensive planning between the United States and Israel to anticipate and defend against the brazen attack we expected.
President Biden has reaffirmed America's ironclad support for Israel, even as it rebuffs Washington's calls for a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. Other world leaders are urging the country to step back from the brink of a regional war, but with daily bombardment of Gaza, ground troops in Lebanon, and a pledge to strike Iran, not even Israel's closest allies appear able to deter it from escalating this conflict. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's take this on. Let's bring in our guest from Tel Aviv. We are joined by Dan Perry, who's a journalist and author of the book Israel and the Quest for Permanence. In London is Roxane Farmanfarmaian, who's a professor of modern Middle East politics at the University of Cambridge. And in Berlin is Julian Barnes-Dacey, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa programme at the European Council for Foreign Relations. Hello all. Dan, I'd like to start with you, if I may, Dan Perry in Tel Aviv. There's a piece that you wrote, I'm guessing it must have been pretty soon after the Iranian attacks last night, laying out 3 possible courses of action. And I think it'll help our discussion if I just very quickly go through them. 1, a more symbolic response against Iran, taking into account the fact that Iran did telegraph the attack and no Israeli lives were lost. 2, a tactical strike on Iran, perhaps against oil installations, forcing Iran to reconsider further retaliation. Or 3, a third path, you said, an attempt to overhaul the region's balance of power, where Israel might use bunker-busting bombs to cripple Iran's nuclear facilities, destroy oil facilities, blockade ports, which would, of course, in my words, bring with it implicit danger of the war spreading further afield. Of those 3, Dan Perry, which do you think is the most likely?
A lot depends on what happens behind closed doors in talks with the Americans, who, despite protestations, I think are pretty closely aligned with Israel and probably coordinating with Israel. If the Israelis extract from the Americans a credible promise of a paradigm shift vis-a-vis Iran, and for support in their project to eliminate the Hezbollah threat in Lebanon, which I think, frankly, is a favor to Lebanon, then they might suffice with a symbolic response. Note that of my three, I really discount the possibility of zero response because the feeling is strong in Israel that you just can't absorb 200 ballistic missiles, one of the most concentrated missile attacks, I think, in history of warfare, and do nothing. Not only because, of schoolyard infantile notions of petty revenge, but because doing nothing would encourage further such aggression. I understand there's a war of narratives here, but from Israel's perspective, Iran has no business surrounding it with proxy militias, fomenting so much chaos on its borders, or firing rockets at its major cities. So Israel feels aggrieved, and when a country is aggrieved, they might react badly.
Roxane, Farmanfarmaian, when Iran made the calculation to fire those missiles yesterday, they will have tried, you assume, to make an educated guess on Israel's likely response. How do you think they think Israel will respond?
Well, I think they were very calculated in being sure to avoid civilian casualties. I think that's been one of the reasons why in this war Israel has been condemned for the way that it has conducted this war, is the degree of civilian casualties. So Iran has attempted to distinguish its actions as quite different than Israel's. And I think that it has also calculated not just Israel's response, but the way that the other Arab neighborhood would respond. In other words, those that are in the Gulf, Turkey and Egypt, for example, which are little by little what Iran hopes are coming together to create an Islamic front, if you will, against the attacks by Israel in both Lebanon and on Gaza. So I think it expects a retaliation. I think that's what we saw the first time around in April. But because these were targeted very much at military targets, the response it hopes will, I imagine, not be one that will draw the United States into a larger war.
And as you look at it very briefly, what's your sense? Would it be, which of those three, would it be a more symbolic response, a tactical strike, or that with, an attempt to overhaul the region's architecture?
Well, I think that it's been generally considered that to hit Iran's nuclear facilities is a huge gamble for Israel, despite the fact that it has a history of wiping out other countries' nuclear facilities, because they are located deep inside Iran and because there are so many of them. So I think probably my feeling is that there will be a symbolic response, but one that perhaps is bigger than the last symbolic response in April.
Julian, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but Dan, you wanted to jump in.
Well, yeah, I certainly understand the importance that no one was killed in Israel, and it is frankly amazing, and I think testament to many things, including the American assistance, the impressive quality of Israel's air defenses, and the fact that Iran appears indeed to have tried to limit its own success by telegraphing what it was going to do to the Americans and the Russians. That said, the idea that Iran targeted military bases, with respect to my colleague in London, is pretty close to absurd. I was in the center of Tel Aviv, conurbation of 3 million people, and there were interceptions going on over my head. Now, you can say it's based at military headquarters right in the center of Tel Aviv. Sure, you could say that. You could say the bomb that landed on the Herzliya beach was, half mile away from one of the Mossad headquarters, and you can pretend that's relevant. It trashed a restaurant and landed closest to a major condominium apartment building. There's no way you can say they targeted only military bases. If they wanted to do that, there are isolated bases in Israel.
I just want Roxane to come back.
We had dozens and dozens of
Roxane,
missiles
just come back to that very briefly. Very briefly, Roxane. Dan, we'll come back to you in a sec. Roxane, very briefly to that, and then I must move on to Julian.
Yes, I think the facts speak for themselves in that there were no civilian casualties. And to send over 200 plus missiles of the caliber that Iran did, it means that it was very carefully calibrated not to create civilian casualties.
Okay, Julian Barnes-Dacey, what is your sense then of what path Israel will take to retaliation? To what extent will they go?
Sense is that they're going to have to do more than they did following the April attacks by Iran. And at that moment, it was more of a symbolic response. I think Netanyahu has made clear that we should expect something more emphatic this time round. 200 ballistic missiles is a far more serious attack than happened in April. And I think, equally important, this comes to the backdrop of Israel feeling more confident and aggressive, I think, than at any moment in the course of this conflict in terms of its ability to go after Iran. Obviously, we've seen them take serious measures against Hezbollah, in many ways decapitating the top leadership of the movement. And there's a real sense, I think, coming out of Israel that this is a moment to remake the region. And by that, they mean really striking Iran in a more powerful way that knocks out their strategic capabilities. And I think the danger is that the Americans seem to be on board with this. We saw an article in Politico yesterday in which senior Biden administration officials were seemingly encouraging Israel along these lines. And I'm very worried. I think this is a very dangerous illusion. We've seen multiple attempts over the last 25 years to remake the Middle East. And on every occasion, it leads to more conflict, destruction, and state collapse. And I don't think the Iranians will not respond to a more serious attack in kind. So we're locked in this escalation ladder right now, and there doesn't appear to be any serious off-ramp.
All right, well, we'll try and discuss that in a little bit to see what potential there is for an off-ramp. But Dan, the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, he tweeted earlier that Israel has now its greatest opportunity in 50 years to change the face of the Middle East. We must act now, he said, to destroy Iran's nuclear program, its central energy facilities, and to fatally cripple this terrorist regime. We have the justification, he said, we have the tools. That's a former prime minister, Dan, saying the moment is now. The appetite is pretty evident there in Israel.
Yeah, look, you have to understand, Israel is a deeply divided society as regards what to do with the Palestinians and should there be a state in the West Bank, a few miles from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, perhaps being taken over by Hamas. These are complex issues where Israel is badly divided, and Netanyahu's policies are not popular. But Iran's chaos project in the region, support for the Houthis, which have brought 500,000 casualties to Yemen, support for Hezbollah, that I believe is detested by most Lebanese, support for the Shiite militias in Iraq, and especially the nuclear program, which is not an innocent nuclear program by France. This is a nuclear program run by an aggressive theocracy that has more than hinted that it wants to destroy Israel. This stuff is basically consensual, and it's consensual in Israel that this whole thing is unacceptable. Now, indeed, for a country of 10 million to take on a country of almost 100 million is generally not that great an idea, and there is respect for Iran's ability to defend itself, or at least defend its right to commit this aggression. So I think Israel has been careful about taking on Iran directly, but the idea that if at all possible, the non-democratic totalitarian theocracy in Iran must somehow be compelled to end what I'm calling its chaos project, that's pretty popular. And the question becomes a practical one. What is the cost? Can it conceivably work? And as I suggested in my first response, I think much will depend on whether they think they can get the Americans behind them. And there is a ticking clock that is Iran's effort to achieve a nuclear weapon, at which point it will be very impossible, very difficult, and perhaps impossible to deter. Now, you can talk about escalation all you want. Would you have told Winston Churchill in 1940-41 not to escalate? I mean, there's a point where there's a problem that must be fixed.
We haven't got much time at the show, Dan. We must move on because we don't have a great deal of time. So, Roxane, first of all, just come back to that and talk to us a little bit about what Dan was saying about this, the shadow of the nuclear project.
Well, I think that I certainly agree with him that this war, particularly against Hezbollah, has brought many in the, from what we see on the outside, many in the Israeli community and society together. I think we're seeing polls where the support for Netanyahu has risen in the way he's conducting the war. He has succeeded in taking the international gaze off of Gaza, despite rising deaths in Gaza. And I think it's extraordinary that in many ways, likewise, we're not hearing anything about the hostages. So I think he's setting out on a much larger project. And the question that I would like to raise in this is something that no doubt those in Iran are also thinking about, perhaps already having been in a situation like Israel, in that it is alienating itself from the larger region enormously. I think there is a case to be made that Israel is becoming ever less absorbable in the region. And I think that that is an outcome it's got to think about if it's going to continue this campaign against not only its neighbors, but against Iran. So about its nuclear... Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry. So, Dan, let me just give you the chance to come back to that, and Julian, we'll come back to you. So any concern on that feeling of ostracization, that this ongoing violence or the ongoing route that Israel is on will continue to ostracize Israel in the eyes of many elements of the international community?
Look, I think it certainly is a concern. I think Israel's government has utterly failed in public diplomacy. I don't think they've conducted themselves very cleverly in Gaza. By the way, the deaths in Gaza are not rising. In fact, they've been far less rate than before. It's very low web. I don't think Israel's attacking its neighbors. I think Israel is attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon. I think Israel feels aggrieved by what she correctly says is its abandonment in much of global public opinion. But they mostly care about what the U.S. does. The U.S. appears to be behind them, and to underscore, whereas Israel's policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians are, in my personal opinion, misguided to the point of suicidal in the West Bank in particular. This issue with removing Hezbollah from Lebanon, I think Israel thinks that this is not going to be so unpopular in the Arab world. Note that Saudi Arabia has been holding up aid to Lebanon because of Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. There's a lot of good that's going to be showered on Lebanon the minute Hezbollah is gone. And I know from experience with Lebanese, not just expatriates in opposition, but just Lebanese who are not necessarily Shiites, whose support is essentially bought and engineered by Iran.
Okay, listen, we've got to move it on. Dan, we've got to move it on. We have to move it on. And just, Dan, we have to move it on to Julian. We need to move the conversation on. Please, we've only got 10 minutes left. We've already spent a lot of time on this. So, Julian, and first of all, Dan, I should just say the numbers of people dying in Gaza is still going up. Julian, it is an incredibly fraught, dangerous time. If Israel does choose Route 3, which is targeting nuclear facilities and crippling oil installations and so forth, how dangerous a moment is this for the world?
Well, obviously, it'd be hugely dangerous. And I think it's also just worth pointing out that the kind of your option 2 is quite easily a track towards option 3. We start going back and forth in terms of attacks, and I think we quite quickly end up in something wider. Obviously, a conflict that engulfs the entire Middle East, a more direct, full-encompassing conflict between Israel and Iran would be incredibly worrying and serious. We could see serious and wide-ranging attacks by Israel, but I think we're probably underplaying what Iran could still do towards Israel, and also the capability of Hezbollah to launch wider attacks on Israel. Israel has faced attacks from Hezbollah since October 8th, but Hezbollah has nonetheless not used its higher quality and more long-distance missiles upon the country. Obviously, the fact that Iran has allied partners in Syria and Iraq and Yemen points to broader ramifications. There's energy market ramifications. There are some indications that Israel might go after Iran's oil facilities. Iran in kind might have indicated that it will go after other regional oil facilities to ensure that everyone pays the price. So clearly, we should be very worried there are enormous, grave consequences to this in terms of the humanitarian suffering, the destabilization, and the risk of nuclear proliferation. So I don't think this is something to be taken lightly. And I do think there needs to be much more serious effort to try and create an off-ramp here, which to my mind does involve preventing the Israelis from doing something much more serious at this moment. It does involve the necessity of a ceasefire in Gaza.
Roxane, where is the off-ramp as far as you're concerned?
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention was there's also something that the foreign minister from Canada mentioned yesterday, that there are two other great powers that should possibly be more involved. And I would say Russia already is more involved. The Russian prime minister visited Iran the morning before the launch of its missiles against Israel, saying that Israel should not get involved in Lebanon, it should withdraw. And so it's obviously beginning to use its voice in terms of discussing this region. And it has been the one that has supplied Iran whatever foreign munitions it has. And so we're seeing, in some sense, a balance by Russia against America in this. And I think certainly the Chinese are looking in with interest. And I think it would be wiser for us to look at this as having global implications. I completely agree with my colleague in Europe that this is something that possibly, without us even being aware of, is backing into a much larger war if the United States should get involved, if Iran retaliates with greater intensity. This could really become, for the first time, I'm seeing that this could become considerably larger in scope.
Dan Perry, both China and Russia have a strategic relationship, of course, with Iran, and they could easily get swept up in all of this, and that has very serious implications, doesn't it?
Look, I certainly agree that if Israel does a big action in Iran and the result is an even bigger action, the U.S. gets pulled in, it has interests all over the Persian Gulf. China and Russia could be tempted to up the ante with Taiwan and Ukraine, and you're looking at possibly World War III. I don't, in any way, am I not sanguine about all this? I personally hope that Israel does my option one and responds symbolically, but because it can't do nothing. But I also have written in the past that the world needs to stop tolerating the Iran chaos project. And I think Israel will be in the background asking the U.S. and the EU and NATO to promise that they will, shortly after the U.S. election, go to Iran and say, no more proxies, no more nukes, no more long-range rockets, no more insanity, else you will face consequences. Now, whether those involve blockading its ports or degrading its oil installations or bunker busting its nuclear program, I don't know. But I think the U.S. might actually do this because there's a ticking clock with nuclear Iranian deterrence coming up. And the idea that Russia is a good faith interlocutor or that Iran is somehow a positive player in the Middle East, guys, friends on this panel, it's absurd.
Okay.
So toxic
Julian,
Netanyahu may be.
Julian,
Israel
where is the path? Where is the path to a diplomatic solution, Julian?
So I think that really the only path towards a diplomatic solution is the US. We have seen the US offering full-hearted support for Israel, both in terms of this offensive, but also in terms of Netanyahu's repeated failures to engage with a viable ceasefire plan. Gaza and the ongoing conflict there is the core of this ongoing problem. Whether we like it or not, the solution towards a regional de-escalation is a ceasefire in Gaza. We then obviously have to deal with the wider implications, the challenges and threats posed by Iran and its regional partners. But the first step, I think, is to rein in Israel's escalatory actions in Gaza. It is the one that is now taking the fight to Hezbollah in Lebanon in a more escalatory fashion. And I think until Biden is prepared to put Netanyahu under that pressure, we aren't going to see an off-ramp.
So Roxane, diplomacy has abjectly failed on Gaza so far. So in your view, as you observe this situation and the danger that it presents, do you think that the United States is capable, if it has the will, of dissuading Benjamin Netanyahu from this course that he seems determined to pursue? Well,
up until now, nothing that the United States has suggested or appeared to be promoting has been adopted by the Israeli government. Certainly no ceasefire plan. And although Biden has frequently noted that he's been working tirelessly to find a diplomatic solution, I think that it's clear there hasn't been one that has even been tried. So I think the result at the moment is to show that the United States either doesn't have the influence or it is lacking the will. And I think that in some sense we can see the second part as much at play, that it's an election year. It is not in many ways in the interest, certainly of the Kamala Harris and Biden administration to take strong steps at this point. They are in need of much of the support that they can get and to keep the focus on domestic politics. So I think certainly Netanyahu sees an opening for at least until the time of the election in order to do an escalatory move, because I don't think anything is going to really be exerted from Washington.
Okay, and Dan Perry, on the US election, there's not long to go till that happens. Is this how you think it's playing out in Netanyahu's mind?
Yeah, I think he certainly has time to act until then, because the U.S. is terrified of a major escalation, so they might go along with a minor one. They don't want to be seen as fighting with Israel. That would harm them with Jews in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. They don't want to be seen as too much supporting Israel in an escalation that would harm them with Muslims in Michigan. So it's a total wedge issue in the U.S., and the U.S. would like for all this to go away. But I think part of the complexity here is that even though some may be sanguine about a so-called ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power in Gaza, Israel has trouble with that scenario, and so does the U.S., which is why they haven't that much pressured Israel. There's this notion that Israel refuses a ceasefire because they like to fight. Let me assure you, they don't. The issue is they're in a pickle, and they're not sure what more to do to get Hamas and Hezbollah to go away. Now, both of these groups are funded and goaded by Iran, and therefore Iran is very much involved in the aggression against Israel. It's complicated, and there's not a lot of rights and wrongs here. But I urge us to not be naive about groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. These are not good guys who want peace. So we have a problem, and it requires cleverness and strategy and maybe some human decency as well.
Yes, the complexity is very, very real. We're out of time. The coming hours and days will indeed be very telling. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our guests, Dan Perry, Roxane Farmanfarmaian, and Julian Barnes-Dacey. And thank you too for watching. You can check out the show again whenever you like at our website, aljazeera.com, and just tell us what you think at our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X and on Instagram. Our handle for both is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.